I'm back for Chapter 2 of Jacques Ellul's The Technological Society, and Chapter 2 is entitled The Characterology of Technique. Now, it's kind of interesting that he uses that term, characterology, because, as I understand it, it's usually the study of the development of character in human beings, but here it's the study of the development of the character of technique. And I say that's interesting because he does almost treat technique as though it is a living thing, and it has a mind of its own, so to speak. It's certainly beyond the individual's control. And modern technique, he's argued in the first chapter, has become something qualitatively different from previous techniques or technological innovations. And so in this chapter, he starts out just trying to impress upon people how different it is and how things were different before the modern era, and particularly how people thought differently about work and about technique. You know, it's very normal for people to think that the way that they think and the way their society is the way things have always been, or that basically what they see around them is a manifestation of human nature as such, and they can't see beyond it. And so it is useful that Ellul basically says in this chapter, at the beginning of this chapter, people didn't always think this way. Here's an interesting spot where he talks about primitive man, by which I think he means tribal peoples. He says for primitive man and for historical man until a comparatively late date, work was a punishment, not a virtue. It was better not to consume than to have to work hard. The rule was to work only as much as absolutely necessary in order to survive. Man worked as little as possible and was content with a restricted consumption of goods, a prevalent attitude which limits both techniques of production and techniques of consumption. Yeah, boy, does that sound familiar, because Alexis de Tocqueville, when he came over here in the mid-19th century to the United States and observed the clash between the Native American tribal peoples and the white European settlers, and he had much sympathy for the Native Americans because he said that they displayed an aristocratic mentality as opposed to the sort of base bourgeois mentality of the average American settler. And what he meant by that was that the Native Americans did, as Ellul is describing here, they looked down upon work, especially hard manual work. And he says that they observed the white settlers farming and building and everything from sunup to sundown, and they considered it sort of slavish or menial, and not to mention just irrational. In their view, they had everything that they needed. They had the skills to go get it when they needed it, in hunting, fishing, gathering, etc. And furthermore, they were willing to put up with quite a great degree of discomfort in order to have that freedom. In other words, Tocqueville thought that they knew the trade-offs, and they still saw the white way of life as servile and menial and degrading. And so they could see that, whites were more comfortable in their little cabins set on their property, all fenced in, etc. But it seemed to them a life not worth living because you had to trade all of that time, and of course time was freedom, right? Whereas from the white settler perspective, or more broadly the American sort of Protestant perspective, I think of the Protestant work ethic, right? The Native Americans appeared lazy and just irrational, and they needed to get with the program. They needed to become civilized, and if they couldn't be civilized, well, then it was justifiable to wipe them out, because obviously their way of life was was irrational and didn't produce anything of consequence. From their perspective, virtue was all about hard work and building things up and changing nature and making it into something much more valuable, as John Locke said in the second treatise of government. In his view, the Native Americans didn't really have any right to the land, or people like that generally, because they didn't do anything with it. He said that it's just a waste and a void that God gave people, but really worthless until people work with it and work with it hard and build it up and produce abundance of goods and civilize themselves. So there's a lot of backing, I guess I'm saying, for Ellul's observation here, that indeed there is this change in mentality, and the modern European, say, bourgeois mentality sees work as a virtue, and not wanting to work as some grave moral defect. But yet there was a time and a place and peoples where work was done in order to live, and they see the opposite as living in order to work, and they find that depraved. And he goes on to mention the Middle Ages. He says the Middle Ages also were concerned with comfort, but for them, comfort had an entirely different form and content. So here he's contrasting the bourgeois mentality, which desires as much comfort as possible, with the Middle Ages, and he's saying the people of the Middle Ages had a notion of comfort, but it was completely different. It wasn't necessarily sitting in a nice cushy couch by the hearth side having a lot of food or whatever. He said it represented a feeling of moral and aesthetic order. Space was the primary element in comfort. Man sought open spaces, large rooms, the possibility of moving about, of seeing beyond his nose, and of not constantly colliding with other people. So, I mean, imagine the nobles in their really large abodes, their castles, which were drafty and cold and had big wide open spaces and weren't particularly cushy and constantly warm and comfortable. And the nobles, of course, like to go outside and go in their crazy way, running around hunting and jousting and things like that. They seem to seek out discomfort, even though they were the wealthy of the society. They just couldn't stay put. And so, again, there's a contrast there. He's saying, our notions of comfort have been different. Our notions of freedom have been different than they are now. And they would have experienced our way of life as stultifying, as menial, as enslaving. Again, he turns to the Roman Empire, taking a step back in time, and he says, in the Roman Empire, it was possible for a man to withdraw and live as a hermit or in the country apart from the evolution and the principal technical power of the empire. Roman law was powerless in the face of an individual's decision to evade military service or, to a very great degree, imperial taxes and jurisdiction. Even greater was the possibility of the individual's freedom with respect to material techniques. Well, that simply because the empire, as large and as powerful as it was, did not have the technical capacity to keep track of everybody. And so an individual could simply get lost. An individual could just decide to leave and never be heard from again and go live someplace else, and most likely would be able to get away with it. And that condition continued for a long, long time because the state just didn't have the power and the ability to keep track of people. So part of the change into modern times has been a change in values, a change in what people value and how they perceive freedom. And I think Ellul is going to argue that their perceptions have partly been changed by technique itself, that is, as human abilities increased and the way that they planned and made things and lived became more systematic, more rational, more conscious. uh, the more people thought of freedom and comfort in the bourgeois way, right? It's almost like he's saying that at a certain point the genie came out of the bottle, and when people realized uh, the amount of control that they could have over their environment and over their behavior even, and the things around them, um, they began to pursue this at a much greater rate, and techniques aided other techniques, and pretty soon um, they had a different view of what they wanted out of life, without looking behind at what they were losing, that different type of freedom, a different type of equality too, equality of experience in a way. Without looking behind, they looked ahead, and they worked very, very hard past a certain point to be as out of touch with discomfort, out of touch with nature, you might say, as they possibly could be. One of the things that's very characteristic of the modern mindset is that nature becomes sort of the other. Nature becomes this thing that you want to not only control but even avoid as much as possible. Control, is an illusion, of course, as we know every time a hurricane comes along. But to the extent that we can, we did try to control nature, controlling the course of water, expanding agriculture in ways that are truly phenomenal, and of course, building homes and places where we could live and shop that were all indoors. So we became more and more alienated from nature, and this just increased the desire for these creature comforts and our addiction to and dependency upon technique. But at a certain point, Ellul says, we get technical automatism. It seems as though there's a tipping point, again, the genie out of the bottle, I guess, in which technique begins to actually take over and create the goals and the means, and instead of it being in the control of individuals or even political communities. But this seems to be a very convenient thing because everybody seems to be living better. Ellul says, this then is the first aspect of technical automatism. Inside the technical circle, the choice among methods, mechanism, organizations, and formulas is carried out automatically. Man is stripped of his faculty of choice, and he is satisfied. He accepts the situation when he sides with technique. There's a phrase we sometimes use, we make something into a science. Well, that's kind of what he's talking about here. It becomes so much of a science with both, the government and the private sphere using expanding technique. There's a point where the individual just becomes irrelevant. He says the individual's role is less and less important in technical evolution. The more factors there are, the more readily they combine, and the more evident is the urgent need for each technical advance. Advance for its own sake becomes proportionally greater, and the expression of human autonomy proportionally feebler. And this is really, I guess this is the thing that I should hammer home here, is advance for its own sake is what produces this technical automatism. It becomes an assumption, I think, on the part of society as a whole, that advancement is always good, that if you can do it, you should do it, without thought for what that means for how people will live, without thought for how it will impact their value system. A good example that we're living with now is of course, the advent of social media. Social media was created certainly before anybody gave serious thought to maybe rules that ought to apply, etiquette that might apply, um, the age of people that ought to be allowed to be on social media, the just like the idea that social media might require greater and greater levels of self-control, so we should talk about responsibility and self-control more. Instead, we are in a society where self-control and responsibility are talked about less, which is convenient for technique. So, types of social media flourish, but many people will admit that they, the social media, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever, Tumblr, whatever it may be, hasn't not only hasn't made their lives better necessarily, but many people are saying it can make them worse. That especially in young people, the more people use social media, the more depression they have. Um, I don't know how many of my friends over the years have decided to go on a Facebook fast. They've decided that, it's obvious that they're spending too much time on it. Some of them have to quit it entirely because they can't control themselves to the point where they can just use it for, say, 10 minutes a day. They're on it constantly and it's interfering with their ability to work, and it's like an addiction. They have to quit, or else they quit cold turkey if they can. So in many ways, social media is a mixed blessing, and I think we all know that. I've talked to people of all ages about this, and all of them are kind of skeptical, but almost all of us use social media more and more, and we're kind of reliant on it for certain things, like our views about maybe services and goods and services, and oftentimes politics. And of course, in the latest election, we found, social media was so huge that Russia was trying to figure out how to manipulate the election through it. And our current president uses Twitter constantly to communicate. And so if you're going to follow exactly what the President of the United States is doing, you have to have a Twitter account. And then you have to figure out what to think about it, see. So the that's the half that hasn't happened very much. So that's an example of what Ellul is talking about, because the cart has definitely gone before the horse, so to speak, because we didn't think at any point in this process up until it started to become a huge problem, how this could be abused, and maybe what kind of values we should have to control it, or even if we wanted it, which is a revolutionary idea. It's the kind of thing, the kind of question that Ellul wants people to raise is this good for us? Do we really need it? If we do want it, in what way should we have it? In what capacity should we enjoy it? And so on and so forth. And these questions, by the way, I would say in our world today, with all the things that we have at our disposal, requires a type of self-control that has never been required of anybody in the whole history of the human race. So it's a big, tall order to ask people to devise an idea of how they want to live right now, and then follow through, even if it means saying no or only partially saying yes to a variety of techniques and technological innovations. I'm going to quickly run out of time, but I wanted to give one more example of this. In education, Ellul says, this is the way progress takes place in the field of education, too. After the general direction given by initiators like de Crowley or Montessori, it is the findings of thousands of educators which ceaselessly nourish the improvement of technique. I like that mention of technique in education because I think it's far from apparent that all of the innovations in education theory and methods, pedagogical methods, and all the increases in bureaucracy in both primary, secondary, and also in university education, that all of these have yielded a better education. I think many of us would look at our current education system as at least not entirely successful. We are educating almost everybody to a certain degree in the United States, but the level of education can be quite poor and very variable from one place to another, from one state to another, and within a state from one county to another. And students are arguably not very much being educated to become independent critical thinkers with access to their own toolkit, so to speak, but how to take exams, because in our case, technique, trying to make the education system better lately, has been to fund schools, or some variant of this policy, fund schools on the basis of students' test scores and standardized tests. Anyway, I think you all know that story, but I'm sure you could come up with several examples of this just off the top of your head, of where increasing techniques, always promising greater levels of output or quality of services or whatever it may be, quality of life, actually lead to less. And while it's hard for us to imagine going back to the Native American way of life, don't want to be a Plains Indian perhaps, but on some days that way of life doesn't look too bad at this point. And I think this chapter helps people to at least realize, like I started out with, that their way of thinking and their way of life, the way things are now, is not necessarily natural. It's not the way people have always lived, and that introduces the idea of choice. All right, thanks for listening. On to Chapter 3 next week. Bye.